Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Perhaps you've had a long day, or perhaps you simply enjoy drifting off while thinking about stories from the depths of history rather than the worries of tomorrow. Either way, tonight's journey is meant for you. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter, as if the weight of the day has begun to lift away. Tonight we descend into the cold, dark waters of the Pacific Ocean, to a story that unfolded far beneath the waves during one of the most secretive chapters of the Cold War. This is the tale of Project Azorian, a mission so audacious that it seemed almost impossible, a clandestine effort by the Central Intelligence Agency to recover a sunken Soviet submarine from the ocean floor, nearly 17,000 feet below the surface. It is a story of lost sailors and lost secrets, of ingenious engineering and elaborate deception. It involves nuclear weapons resting on the seafloor, acoustic listening posts that could hear sounds from across entire ocean basins, a ship built for a purpose its designers never publicly admitted, and a cover story involving one of the most eccentric billionaires in American history. The narrative unfolds across years and continents, from the shipyards of the Soviet Far East to the listening stations of Alaska, from the boardrooms of Washington to the vast emptiness of the open Pacific. If you enjoy these gentle explorations of remarkable true stories, consider subscribing or sharing a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy listener at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin our descent into the deep. In the years following the Second World War, the world's two remaining superpowers found themselves locked in a confrontation unlike any that had come before. The United States and the Soviet Union, former allies against fascism, now faced each other across ideological battlefields that stretched around the globe. This was the Cold War, a conflict fought not primarily through direct military engagement, but through intelligence operations, technological competition, proxy conflicts, and an ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. Both nations understood that the weapons developed during the previous war had fundamentally changed the nature of conflict itself. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated a destructive power that made conventional notions of victory and defeat almost meaningless. As both superpowers developed their own nuclear arsenals during the late 1940s and 1950s, military planners on both sides grappled with a troubling reality: a full-scale nuclear war between the two nations would likely result in the destruction of both, and perhaps of human civilization itself. This mutual vulnerability gave rise to a doctrine that came to be known as mutually assured destruction, often abbreviated to its grimly appropriate acronym, MAD. The logic was both simple and terrifying. If either side launched a nuclear-first strike against the other, the victim would retain enough surviving nuclear forces to launch a devastating retaliatory strike. The attacker would be destroyed along with the attacked. In this framework, nuclear weapons were not primarily weapons of war in the traditional sense. They were weapons of deterrence, their purpose being not to win conflicts but to prevent them by making the cost of aggression unacceptably high. For this deterrent to function, however, both sides needed to be confident that their retaliatory capability would survive any first strike. Land-based missile silos could be located by enemy intelligence and targeted by increasingly accurate missiles. Bomber aircraft required airfields that could be identified and destroyed. What both sides needed was a way to ensure that a portion of their nuclear arsenal would survive any conceivable attack, hidden and mobile, ready to strike back even after everything else had been destroyed. The answer lay beneath the waves. Submarines had proven their military value during both world wars, particularly as commerce raiders and coastal defense vessels. But the nuclear age transformed them into something far more significant: mobile, nearly undetectable launch platforms for nuclear missiles. A submarine lurking somewhere in the vast expanses of the world's oceans could survive even the most devastating nuclear first strike on its homeland. Its missiles, aimed at the enemy's cities and military installations, would guarantee that aggression would be met with annihilation. The ocean offered submarines something that land-based forces could never achieve: concealment. The depths of the sea are opaque to most forms of observation. Unlike aircraft, which can be tracked by radar, or land forces, which can be photographed by satellites, a submarine at depth is essentially invisible. It could be anywhere within millions of square miles of ocean. No enemy could be certain where it was or where it might strike from. This invisibility was both the submarine's greatest strength and, in a sense, its vulnerability. Because submarines operated in such isolation, they were almost entirely on their own if something went wrong. A submarine in distress in the middle of the ocean might sink and disappear without anyone knowing what had happened or where to look for survivors. The very characteristics that made submarines valuable as weapons platforms also made them dangerous places to serve. The men who crewed these vessels understood the risks. They accepted careers that would take them away from their families for months at a time, to places their loved ones could not imagine, facing dangers they could not discuss. Submarine service attracted a particular kind of person, someone who could handle the isolation, the confinement, and the knowledge that the margin for error was always slim. Both superpowers invested enormously in developing submarine-launched ballistic missiles throughout the 1950s and 60s. The United States Navy developed the Paul Ares missile system, deploying it aboard a growing fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. The Soviet Navy pursued its own parallel programs, working to create vessels that could serve as nuclear deterrent forces patrolling the ocean depths. The diesel-electric submarines of the early Cold War era had significant limitations. They needed to surface or use a snorkel apparatus to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries. This made them vulnerable to detection by aircraft and surface ships. Nuclear-powered submarines, first pioneered by the United States with USS Nautilus in the 1950s, could remain submerged almost indefinitely, limited only by their food supplies and the endurance of their crews. This technology represented a revolutionary advance in submarine capability. The Soviet Union recognized the strategic importance of nuclear-powered submarines and worked urgently to develop their own. But building nuclear submarines was extraordinarily difficult and expensive, requiring sophisticated technology and manufacturing capabilities. While the Soviet nuclear submarine program progressed, the Soviet Navy also worked to extend the useful life of its diesel-electric submarine fleet by adapting these vessels to carry ballistic missiles. One class of Soviet submarines that exemplified this approach was designated Project 629 by Soviet designers and given the NATO reporting name Gulf class by Western intelligence. These were diesel-electric submarines, based on the torpedo attack Foxtrot class hull design, modified to carry 3 ballistic missiles in an enlarged sail structure rising above the main hull. The original Gulf class boats carried the R-13 missile, which had a relatively short range of about 600 nautical miles and required the submarine to surface in order to launch. Beginning in 1966, the Soviet Navy undertook a program to modernize 14 of these Gulf-class submarines under Project 629A. This upgrade replaced the R-13 missiles with a newer R-21 system, which offered significantly improved range of around 700 to 900 nautical miles and, crucially, could be launched while the submarine remained submerged. This capability dramatically improved the survivability of the launching submarine by eliminating the need to surface before firing. The upgraded submarines were designated Gulf II class by NATO intelligence analysts. They remained diesel-electric boats, requiring periodic surfacing or snorkeling to recharge their batteries, which made them more vulnerable to detection than true nuclear submarines. Nevertheless, they represented an important component of the Soviet Union's strategic nuclear deterrent force during the late 1960s. Among the Gulf II class submarines serving in the Soviet Pacific Fleet was a vessel designated K-129. Her keel had been laid down on the 15th of March, 1958, at Shipyard No. 132 in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, a major Soviet naval construction facility on the Amur River in Russia's Far East. She was launched on the 16th of May, 1959, and commissioned into the Soviet Navy at the end of that year. Ka-129 was initially assigned to the 123rd Brigade of the 40th Division of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, based at Vladivostok. In 1960, she was reassigned to the 15th Submarine Squadron based at Rybachi Naval Base on the Kamchatka Peninsula. This remote installation on the sparsely populated peninsula jutting southward from Siberia's Pacific coast served as a major base for Soviet submarines operating in the Pacific Ocean. From 1964 to 1967, Ka-129 underwent the modernization program that upgraded her from the original Gulf configuration to the Gulf II standard. The work was performed at Dalzavod shipyard in Vladivostok. When she returned to service in May of 1967, she carried the newer Ra-21 missile system with its improved range and underwater launch capability. She was now a more capable weapons platform, though still constrained by the limitations of her diesel-electric propulsion system. The submarine was approximately 100 meters long, about 330 feet, with a beam of roughly 8.5 meters. Her displacement when submerged was around 2,700 tons. She could make 15 to 17 knots on the surface and 12 to 14 knots while submerged. Her standard complement was 83 officers and enlisted men, though on her final patrol she would carry additional personnel. Life aboard a submarine like Ka-129 was demanding in ways that few civilian experiences can match. The vessel's interior was cramped, with every available space filled with equipment, stores, or berthing. Sailors lived in close quarters with their shipmates, sharing bunks in what submariners call hot bunking, one sailor sleeping while another worked, then trading places. Privacy was essentially non-existent, and the psychological demands of extended submerged operations could test even the most resilient personalities. The atmosphere aboard a submerged submarine became increasingly stale as the patrol continued. Carbon dioxide scrubbers removed the most dangerous waste gases, but the air never felt truly fresh. Cooking odors, machinery smells, and the accumulated scent of dozens of men living in close quarters combined into an unmistakable submarine atmosphere that veterans would recognize anywhere. Fresh water was precious and strictly rationed. Showers were brief and infrequent. Fresh food ran out within the first weeks of patrol, replaced by canned and preserved provisions that grew increasingly monotonous as the weeks passed. The submarine's cooks worked minor miracles with limited ingredients, knowing that food was one of the few morale boosters available to them. Despite these hardships, submarine crews developed a remarkable esprit de corps. The shared challenges of underwater service created bonds between shipmates that lasted lifetimes. These men depended on each other in ways that surface sailors could never quite understand. A single mistake by one crewman could doom them all. This mutual dependence fostered a culture of professionalism and mutual support that characterized the best submarine crews. Ka-129's commanding officer in early 1968 was Captain First Rank Vladimir Ivanovich Kobzar. At 46 years old, Kobzar was a seasoned submarine commander who had served aboard Ka-129 since before her modernization. His executive officer was Captain Second Rank Alexander Mikhailovich Jurovin. Together, they led a crew that included 20 officers and approximately 60 to 80 enlisted sailors and petty officers. The submarine carried 3 Ra-21 ballistic missiles, each armed with a nuclear warhead estimated at approximately 1 megaton yield. Additionally, Ka-129 was armed with 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, giving her a secondary capability against surface ships and other submarines. The Ra-21 missiles were housed in 3 vertical launch tubes incorporated into the submarine's enlarged sail structure, which rose prominently from the center of the vessel's hull. In 1967, K-129 had successfully completed two 70-day combat patrols, standard deployments during which the submarine would proceed to designated patrol areas in the Pacific Ocean and remain ready to launch her missiles if ordered to do so. These patrols required the submarine to maintain radio silence while remaining hidden from American anti-submarine warfare forces. The patrols were demanding on both the vessel and her crew, requiring weeks of watchfulness in cramped, challenging conditions far from home. After returning from her second patrol in 1967, K-129 and her crew should have had time for extensive rest and refitting before their next deployment. Standard Soviet naval procedure called for substantial intervals between combat patrols to allow for maintenance and crew recovery. However, international events in early 1968 would alter this schedule dramatically. On the 23rd of January, 1968, North Korean naval forces seized the American intelligence ship USS Pueblo in the Sea of Japan. This was one of the most serious international incidents of the Cold War period. The Pueblo was an American naval vessel equipped for signals intelligence collection, and her seizure represented a significant propaganda victory for North Korea and a substantial intelligence loss for the United States. The crisis prompted major American military deployments to the region, including naval forces moving to positions off the Korean peninsula. The Soviet Union, as an ally of North Korea, responded to the increased American military presence with its own heightened alert status. According to some accounts, K-129 was ordered to deploy on an unscheduled combat patrol as part of this response. The submarine had been home for only approximately 6 weeks, roughly half the normal interval between patrols. Some 40 of the 98 men aboard the submarine for this deployment were reportedly new to the vessel, having been recently assigned to K-129 to fill out her complement. On the 24th of February, 1968, K-129 departed Ribachi Naval Base on what was expected to be a 70-day combat patrol with an anticipated completion date of the 5th of May. The submarine proceeded to deep water, conducted a test dive to verify her systems were functioning properly, and surfaced to report by radio that all was well. Then K-129 headed out into the Pacific Ocean and was never seen again by Soviet eyes. The departure from Ribachi would have followed well-established routines. The submarine's crew would have made final preparations in the hours before sailing, loading last-minute supplies, completing paperwork, saying goodbye to families waiting on the pier. The atmosphere would have been a mixture of tension and familiarity, the crew facing another long deployment but drawing comfort from the routines they knew so well. As the submarine cleared the harbor and headed for open water, the families left behind would have begun the long wait that defined life as a submariner's spouse or child. There would be no communication during the patrol, no letters, no phone calls, no way of knowing whether the submarine was safe or in danger. The families could only wait and hope, trusting that their loved ones would return at the scheduled time. The test dive that K-129 conducted before proceeding to her patrol area was standard procedure, a way of verifying that all the submarine systems were functioning correctly after the period in port. The crew would have taken the submarine down to a moderate depth, checking for leaks, verifying the operation of all critical equipment, ensuring that the vessel was ready for the demands of the patrol ahead. The radio check-in that followed the test dive was K-129's last communication with Soviet Naval Headquarters. The brief encrypted transmission confirmed that the submarine had completed her departure procedures successfully and was proceeding to her assigned patrol area. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. And then, silence. Standard operating procedure for Soviet ballistic missile submarines on patrol called for regular radio check-ins at predetermined times. These check-ins were brief encrypted transmissions that confirmed the submarine's status without revealing her precise location. K-129 was expected to break radio silence and transmit a brief report when she crossed the 180th meridian, the international date line, and again when she arrived at her assigned patrol area. The days passed, and the expected radio check-ins did not come. Soviet naval commanders in Kamchatka grew increasingly concerned as Ka-129 missed one scheduled transmission, then another. First, Fleet Headquarters transmitted routine instructions for Ka-129 to break radio silence and report her status. Then more urgent communications followed, all of which went unanswered. The Pacific swallowed the transmissions as completely as it had swallowed the submarine. By the third week of March, 1968, Soviet Naval Headquarters officially declared Ka-129 missing. An extensive search and rescue operation was immediately launched, involving surface ships, naval aircraft, and other submarines deployed from bases in Kamchatka and Vladivostok. The Soviet Navy had a general idea of the patrol route Ka-129 would have followed, but the Pacific Ocean encompasses an enormous area. Without more precise information about where the submarine might have run into trouble, the search was largely a matter of covering as much ocean as possible and hoping to find some evidence of the submarine's fate. The scale of the Soviet search operation reflected the importance of Ka-129 and her mission. Ballistic missile submarines were among the most valuable assets in the Soviet Navy, carrying weapons that could devastate cities on the other side of the world. Losing such a submarine was not merely a tragedy for the crew and their families but also a significant blow to Soviet strategic capabilities. The Navy had to find out what had happened, both to understand the cause and to ensure that whatever had befallen Ka-129 would not happen to other submarines. The search also had a political dimension. The Soviet leadership would have been concerned about the possibility that the Americans had somehow sunk Ka-129. Although the evidence would eventually point away from this theory, in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, it could not be ruled out. The United States had sophisticated anti-submarine warfare capabilities, and American submarines operated in the same waters where Ka-129 had been patrolling. If the Americans had sunk a Soviet submarine, it would represent an extremely serious escalation of the Cold War. The Soviet leadership would need to know the truth before deciding how to respond. This made finding the submarine, or at least determining what had happened to her, a matter of the highest priority. The Soviet search focused on the general area where Ka-129 would have been expected to operate based on her patrol orders. Ships and aircraft swept back and forth across vast stretches of open ocean, looking for any trace of the missing submarine. Oil slicks, debris, life rafts, anything that might indicate what had happened to Ka-129 and whether any of her crew might still be alive. Day after day, the search continued without result. The sudden deployment of substantial Soviet naval forces across the Pacific Ocean did not go unnoticed by the United States. American intelligence analysts observed the unusual pattern of activity and quickly deduced that the Soviets had likely lost a submarine. The frantic nature of the search, the deployment of so many assets, and the areas being covered all suggested that a Soviet vessel had gone missing and that Moscow was urgently trying to find it. American naval intelligence became keenly interested in the Soviet search. If a Soviet submarine had indeed been lost, determining what kind of vessel it was, where it had sunk, and what might have caused its loss could provide valuable intelligence. But beyond mere curiosity, there was another, far more significant possibility. If the lost submarine was a ballistic missile boat, its wreck might contain some of the most closely guarded secrets of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. To help solve the mystery, American intelligence analysts turned to one of the most secret and capable surveillance systems the United States possessed, the sound surveillance system, known by its acronym SOSUS. This underwater acoustic detection network represented one of the most remarkable achievements of Cold War intelligence technology, a system capable of hearing sounds across entire ocean basins and tracking submarines thousands of miles from the nearest listening station. The origins of SOSUS dated back to the late 1940s, when American military planners recognized that Soviet submarines could pose a significant threat to Atlantic shipping lanes and coastal installations. The Navy approached academic researchers to study potential solutions to the submarine detection problem. The resulting research demonstrated that low-frequency sounds could travel enormous distances through the ocean, particularly through a layer of water known as the Deep Sound Channel or SOFAR channel, where temperature and pressure conditions cause sound waves to be refracted in ways that minimized their dispersion. The physics underlying SOSAs were elegant in their simplicity. Sound waves in the ocean travel at speeds that vary with temperature, salinity, and pressure. In certain depth ranges, typically between about 300 and 1,000 meters, these factors combine to create a channel through which sound can travel with minimal loss. Sounds entering this channel are effectively trapped, bouncing between the top and bottom of the channel rather than spreading out in all directions. This allows relatively weak sounds to propagate across thousands of miles of ocean. The United States Navy recognized the strategic implications of this acoustic phenomenon. By placing listening arrays in the right locations, connected to shore-based processing facilities, it would be possible to create a surveillance network that could hear submarines operating across vast ocean areas. The investment required would be substantial, but the capability gained would be invaluable. The first SOSUS arrays were installed in the Atlantic Ocean in the early 1950s, positioned to monitor the approaches to the American East Coast from the open Atlantic. Additional arrays followed in subsequent years, extending coverage and improving the system's ability to track contacts as they moved through different ocean regions. The Pacific installations came later, as the Soviet Pacific Fleet grew in capability and the strategic importance of that ocean increased. By placing arrays of sensitive hydrophones on the seafloor at locations selected to take advantage of these acoustic properties, American engineers created a network that could detect and localize submarines operating thousands of miles away. The system used sophisticated signal processing to analyze the sounds picked up by multiple hydrophone arrays, extracting faint submarine signatures from the background noise of the ocean and determining the bearing to the sound source. When two or more arrays detected the same contact, triangulation could provide an approximate position. The operators who staffed the SOSUS facilities were highly trained specialists who learned to recognize the acoustic signatures of different submarine types. Every class of submarine produced a distinctive sound profile based on its propulsion system, machinery, and hull characteristics. Soviet submarines could often be identified by class and sometimes even individually based on their unique acoustic fingerprints. This allowed American naval intelligence to track the movements of the Soviet submarine fleet with remarkable precision. The first SOSUS arrays were installed in the Atlantic Ocean in the early 1950s, with additional installations following in the Pacific. Shore-based facilities called naval facilities, or NAVFACs, received the data from the undersea arrays via cables and processed it using specialized equipment and highly trained operators. The existence of the system was classified, and elaborate cover stories were developed to explain the shore installations, which were described as oceanographic research stations. By 1968, SOSUS stations had been established at locations around the Pacific Ocean, including installations in Hawaii, on various Pacific islands, and in the Aleutian chain off Alaska. The naval facility at Adak, Alaska, monitored the northwestern Pacific, an area through which Soviet submarines transiting from Kamchatka to patrol areas would typically pass. After American intelligence deduced that the Soviets appeared to have lost a submarine, analysts requested that SOSUS facilities review their acoustic records from early March 1968 to identify any anomalous signals that might be related to a submarine casualty. The SOSUS system routinely recorded the sounds it detected, providing a detailed acoustic history that could be analyzed retrospectively. The review produced significant results. Acoustic analysts identified a distinctive signal recorded on approximately the 8th of March, 1968. According to John P. Craven, a leading American ocean engineer who was involved in the subsequent investigation, the signal appeared to be an isolated, single sound consistent with an explosion or implosion. Craven described it as a good-sized bang. The acoustic event had been recorded by multiple stations, including Air Force installations that monitored for nuclear tests and the SOSUS array at Adak. The acoustic signature that SOSUS recorded told a story to trained ears. When a submarine suffers catastrophic failure at depth, the resulting sounds are distinctive. The implosion of compartments as they are crushed by water pressure, the rush of water into previously sealed spaces, the structural collapse of metal under forces it was never designed to withstand, all of these create acoustic events that propagate through the ocean for enormous distances. The sound from K-129's destruction would have traveled outward in all directions through the Pacific, gradually weakening with distance but retaining enough energy to be detected by sensitive hydrophones hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The slight differences in arrival time at different listening stations allowed analysts to calculate the bearing to the source from each station. Where these bearing lines intersected was the probable location of the acoustic event. The SOSUS system had been designed primarily for tracking submarines, listening for the continuous sounds of machinery and propellers that operating submarines produce. But the system was also valuable for detecting discrete acoustic events like explosions or implosions. The recordings captured by SOSUS on March 8 preserved the sound of K-129's death, a record that Soviet authorities did not possess and could not replicate. Using the data from multiple recording stations, analysts performed triangulation calculations to determine the location from which the sound had originated. The intersecting lines of bearing pointed to a location in the central Pacific Ocean, near latitude 40 degrees north and longitude 180 degrees, essentially on the international date line. This position was hundreds of miles from the area where the Soviet Navy had been conducting its search. Whatever had happened to K-129 had occurred in waters far from where the Soviets were looking. The discrepancy between the actual sinking location and where the Soviets searched was significant. The Soviet Navy had mounted a substantial search operation, committing ships, aircraft, and other submarines to the effort. They had searched the areas where K-129 was supposed to have been based on her patrol orders and expected track. But the submarine had deviated from that expected track, for reasons that remain unclear to this day. Some analysts have speculated that K-129 may have been assigned a new patrol area at the last minute, perhaps in response to the heightened tensions following the Pueblo incident. Others have suggested that the submarine may have experienced some kind of emergency that caused her to change course before the catastrophic event that sank her. The true explanation remains one of the many mysteries surrounding K-129's final patrol. The fact that the Americans knew the submarine's location while the Soviets did not created a remarkable intelligence asymmetry. The United States possessed information about a Soviet submarine that the Soviet Union itself did not have. This asymmetry would prove to be the foundation for everything that followed. The acoustic triangulation provided the United States with something of enormous value, a relatively precise location for the probable wreck site of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, a location that the Soviets themselves did not know. The discrepancy between the American determined location and the Soviet search area likely resulted from the fact that K-129 had deviated from her expected track. The reason for this deviation has never been definitively established. She may have been proceeding to a newly assigned patrol area, or she may have encountered some emergency that caused her to change course before the catastrophic event occurred. American naval intelligence quickly recognized the significance of this discovery. A Gulf II class submarine like K-129 would be carrying R-21 ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads, along with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. The submarine's wreck might also contain Soviet cryptographic equipment and code materials, nuclear propulsion technology, if she had been a nuclear-powered boat, which she was not, and a wealth of other intelligence about Soviet submarine design and capabilities. However, the wreck lay at an extraordinary depth. The SOSUS-derived position indicated that K-129 had sunk in approximately 16,500 feet of water, more than 3 miles below the surface. This was far deeper than any previous salvage operation had ever attempted. The deepest point in the ocean, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, is about 36,000 feet, so K-129's depth was not quite halfway to the absolute maximum. But from a practical salvage perspective, the wreck might as well have been on the moon. At such depths, the pressure is enormous, more than 7,000 pounds per square inch. Human divers could not operate anywhere near these depths without being crushed. Even the most advanced deep-diving submersibles of the era could barely reach such depths and would be unable to perform complex recovery work if they did. Any attempt to retrieve materials from the wreck would require technology that did not yet exist. But before the question of recovery could even be considered, the United States first needed to confirm the wreck's location and assess its condition. For this task, the Navy turned to one of its most capable and secretive assets, the nuclear-powered submarine USS Halibut. USS Halibut had been commissioned in 1959 as one of the first nuclear-powered submarines designed to carry guided missiles. She was originally equipped to launch Regulus cruise missiles, large radar-guided weapons that required the submarine to surface for launch. By the mid-1960s, however, the Regulus system had become obsolete, replaced by more capable submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Halibut was scheduled for decommissioning until a visionary naval officer proposed a radical alternative. John P. Craven, who held the title of Chief Scientist of the Navy's Special Projects Office and directed the Deep Submergent Systems Project, saw an opportunity to convert Halibut into something unprecedented, a covert deep ocean search and recovery platform. Under Craven's direction, the submarine underwent extensive modifications in 1965 at a cost of approximately $70 million, an enormous sum for the time. The converted Halibut was equipped with an array of sophisticated sensors and systems unlike anything previously installed on a submarine. She received advanced side-scan sonar equipment, extensive photographic and video cameras designed for deep ocean imaging, a Spey Univac 1224 computer for data processing, and specialized side thrusters that allowed her to maneuver precisely while hovering over the ocean floor. Her forward missile hangar, no longer needed for Regulus weapons, was converted to house a remotely operated towed search vehicle, called a fish by the crew, which could be lowered to great depths while the submarine remained at a safe operating level. Perhaps most remarkably, Halibut was also equipped with a saturation diving habitat, allowing specially trained divers to operate at substantial depths when the submarine's mission required human intervention outside the hull. The converted vessel was redesignated SSN 587, indicating her new role as an attack submarine rather than a guided missile platform. USS Halibut's capabilities were among the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. Her missions remain classified to this day, though some have been revealed over the subsequent decades. She is known to have participated in Operation Ivy Bells, a program that tapped Soviet underwater communication cables in the Sea of Okhotsk. And in August of 1968, she was tasked with perhaps her most significant mission, locating and photographing the wreck of Ka-129. Working from the approximate position derived from SOSUS acoustic data, Halibut proceeded to the search area in the Pacific and began methodically surveying the ocean floor using her towed search vehicle. The task was extraordinarily difficult. Even with the SOSUS data narrowing the search area, Halibut was looking for a relatively small object spread across thousands of square miles of seafloor, all while operating at depths far beyond normal submarine operations. The search vehicle deployed from Halibut scanned the bottom with sonar and cameras, transmitting data back to the submarine where analysts examined it for any sign of the wreck. The process was painstaking and slow. Days turned into weeks as the submarine crisscrossed the search area, her crew working in shifts to process the continuous flow of sensor data. Then, on the 20th of August, 1968, nearly 6 months after Ka-129 had disappeared, the cameras found her. The images that came back were remarkable. There, on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, more than 3 miles beneath the surface, lay the shattered hull of a Soviet submarine. The vessel was broken into 2 major sections, with the sail structure and missile compartment showing extensive damage. The images revealed a 10-foot hole immediately behind the conning tower, suggesting a catastrophic failure in the missile compartment area. Over the following 3 weeks, Halibut conducted an extensive photographic survey of the wreck. The submarine's cameras captured more than 20,000 close-up photographs, documenting every visible aspect of K-129's final resting place. The images showed the bow section largely intact forward of the break point but revealed massive internal destruction where the hull had been compromised. The wreck rested on a gently sloping section of seafloor, her hull pointing generally upward from the surrounding sediment. The photographic evidence allowed analysts to begin piecing together what might have happened to K-129. The damage pattern suggested an explosion in the sail area, possibly involving one of the RO-21 missiles. Soviet ballistic missile submarines of this era used liquid-fueled missiles, which were inherently more dangerous than the solid-fueled missiles developed by the United States. The propellants used in liquid-fueled missiles were highly corrosive and could be unstable. A leak in a missile tube could potentially lead to an explosion. Some analysts speculated that a leaking missile tube hatch seal might have allowed seawater to contact missile propellant, triggering a fire and explosion similar to what would later happen to the Soviet submarine K-219 in 1986. Others suggested that a hydrogen explosion in the submarine's battery compartment might have initiated the casualty. The true cause has never been definitively established and may never be known with certainty. What was clear from the photographs was that K-129 had suffered a sudden, violent catastrophe that killed her entire crew before anyone had time to send a distress signal or escape the submarine. The crew of 98 men had gone to their deaths in the darkness 3 miles down, their final moments known only to themselves and to the silent waters that now entombed them. The photographs that Halibut brought back told a story of catastrophic violence frozen in time. The Soviet submarine lay on the seafloor at an angle, her bow section pointing somewhat upward from the slope of the sediment-covered bottom. The forward section of the hull, containing the torpedo room and crew quarters, appeared to be largely intact, though the pressure at depth had certainly affected the structure in ways not visible from external observation. The sail structure, that raised section of the submarine that housed the periscope shears and missile launch tubes, showed extensive damage. The 3 R-21 ballistic missiles, housed in vertical tubes within the sail, were the primary targets of intelligence interest, but the photographs suggested that this area had been severely compromised by whatever catastrophe had befallen the submarine. A massive hole behind the conning tower indicated where the pressure hull had been breached, likely by an internal explosion. The missile compartment damage was particularly significant for understanding both the cause of the sinking and the prospects for recovering useful intelligence. If one of the R-21 missiles had exploded during preparation for launch or due to some structural failure in its containment, the resulting destruction might have damaged or destroyed the very systems that made the missiles valuable intelligence targets. Yet the missiles themselves, or what remained of them, were still aboard the submarine. Even damaged missile components could reveal much about Soviet technology. Looking at the photographs, analysts could see individual features of the wreck with remarkable clarity given the depth and darkness. The camera systems on Halibut's towed search vehicle had performed exceptionally well, capturing images that would guide all future planning for the recovery operation. Every hatch, every fitting, every visible detail was documented for later study. The condition of the submarine's exterior gave clues to her final moments. There was no evidence of collision with another vessel, which tended to argue against theories that K-129 had been struck by an American submarine. The damage patterns were consistent with internal failure rather than external impact. Whatever had happened to K-129 had originated from within, not from without. The photography mission also documented the debris field around the wreck. When K-129 imploded or broke apart during her descent to the bottom, pieces of equipment and structure had scattered across the seafloor around her final resting place. Some of this debris might contain valuable intelligence in its own right, but recovering scattered small objects from the abyssal plain would be far more difficult than recovering the submarine hull itself. The cold at such depths was a preserving factor. The temperature at the bottom of the Pacific in this region hovers near freezing, cold enough to slow decomposition and preserve materials that would quickly degrade in warmer waters. The submarine had essentially been refrigerated since she sank, her contents potentially preserved in something approaching their original condition. The photographs and sonar data from Halibut's mission made their way back to Washington, where they were analyzed by intelligence officials and military planners. The images confirmed that K-129's nuclear missiles were still aboard the wreck. At least a portion of the submarine, including sections that might contain cryptographic equipment and other valuable intelligence, appeared to be potentially recoverable. The question was no longer whether the United States knew where the submarine was. The question was whether there was any possible way to retrieve her from her tomb 3 miles beneath the Pacific. The intelligence value of K-129 cannot be overstated. For American analysts, the opportunity to examine a Soviet ballistic missile submarine in detail would be like receiving a gift from the enemy. Every aspect of the vessel, from the construction of her hull to the design of her weapons systems, could provide insights that would be invaluable for both offensive and defensive purposes. Understanding how Soviet submarines were built would help American anti-submarine warfare forces detect and track them more effectively. Studying the missiles would reveal Soviet capabilities and potentially their limitations. Examining the communications and cryptographic equipment might allow American intelligence to break Soviet codes or understand how the Soviets protected their most sensitive information. But the value went beyond the physical equipment. Even the documentation aboard the submarine could prove invaluable. Patrol orders, code books, communication protocols, personnel records, all of these could provide insights into Soviet naval operations that would be impossible to obtain any other way. The submarine was essentially a floating intelligence archive, preserved by the cold and pressure of the deep. The task seemed almost impossible. No one had ever attempted to lift an object of significant size from anything approaching such depths. The technical challenges were staggering. Any recovery system would need to reach down more than 16,000 feet through the water column, grapple with a wrecked submarine weighing several thousand tons, and raise it to the surface without allowing the prize to slip away. All of this would need to be done in secret, without the Soviet Union or the rest of the world learning what the United States was attempting. The task would fall to the Central Intelligence Agency, which had the resources, the mandate for covert operations, and the independence from military bureaucracy necessary to attempt something so unprecedented. But the CIA would need help from some of the most innovative engineers and shipbuilders in America. And they would need a cover story so elaborate, so convincing, that it would hide the most ambitious salvage operation in history in plain sight. The decision to proceed with what would become Project Azorian was made at the highest levels of the American government. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird endorsed the concept, and President Richard Nixon authorized the CIA to begin planning a recovery operation. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were keenly interested in what the submarine might reveal about Soviet nuclear capabilities and communication security. The project would eventually cost approximately $800 million, equivalent to more than $5 billion in modern currency. It would involve the construction of an entirely new type of vessel, engineered specifically for this single mission. It would require the creation of a submersible recovery system capable of operating at depths no mechanical system had ever reached while performing useful work. And it would need a cover story convincing enough to explain why all of this equipment was being built and deployed. For the cover story, the CIA turned to one of the most famous and reclusive figures in American business, Howard Hughes. Hughes was an aerospace pioneer, a movie producer, and one of the wealthiest men in America. He was also famously eccentric, obsessively secretive, and known for pursuing unusual business ventures. A story involving Howard Hughes doing something strange would be inherently believable, because Howard Hughes was always doing something strange. The cover would involve deep-sea mining, specifically the extraction of manganese nodules from the ocean floor. These potato-sized mineral deposits, scattered across vast areas of the deep Pacific, had attracted genuine interest from mining companies as a potential source of valuable metals including manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt. Several companies had been exploring the possibility of harvesting these nodules from the seafloor. Through intermediaries, the CIA approached Hughes's organization in 1972 with a proposal. The cover story would claim that Hughes's Global Marine Development Company was constructing a revolutionary deep-sea mining vessel to extract manganese nodules from the Pacific seabed. The ship would be named Hughes Glomar Explorer, combining the Hughes name with Glomar, a syllabic abbreviation of Global Marine. In reality, the vessel would be designed and built to raise a Soviet submarine from the ocean floor. Hughes himself apparently had minimal direct involvement in the operation, but he provided what the CIA needed most, a plausible civilian front that would attract little suspicion. Howard Hughes building a bizarre experimental ship for some unprecedented deep-sea venture? That was exactly the kind of thing Howard Hughes would do. The cover story practically wrote itself. The engineering challenges of actually building a ship capable of performing this recovery defied easy description. The vessel would need to lower a massive mechanical claw more than 3 miles through the water, position it precisely over the submarine wreck, grasp the target, and raise it to the surface without the cargo breaking free or the ship capsizing from the enormous weight. No ship had ever been built for anything remotely like this task. The job of designing and constructing the vessel fell to Global Marine Development, working under CIA contract. The company's engineers began by studying the problem from first principles. How much did the submarine weigh? How strong would the lifting system need to be? How would the ship maintain position over a precise point on the seafloor while conducting operations that might take days or weeks? The answers that emerged were staggering. The recovery system would need to lift an estimated 4,000 tons or more from the ocean floor. The pipe string lowering the capture vehicle would itself weigh millions of pounds when fully extended. The ship would need to maintain position to within a few feet while this enormous load swung from her hull. Any significant movement would create forces that could snap cables, damage equipment, or cause the captured submarine to break apart and fall back to the seafloor. To solve these problems, the engineers developed several innovative systems. The most critical was a massive mechanism mounted in the center of the ship called the gimbal. This device would absorb the motion of the ship while keeping the pipe string relatively stationary, preventing wave action from jerking on the cable and its precious cargo. The gimbal weighed approximately 630 tons and was so large that building it required the construction of a special crane ship, the Sun 800, just to lift the gimbal into position during the vessel's assembly. The ship was built at Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Chester, Pennsylvania, beginning in 1971. She was truly enormous, 619 feet long, 116 feet in beam, with a displacement of approximately 50,500 tons. In the center of the ship was a massive opening called the moon pool, large enough to accommodate the submarine once it was raised. The moon pool could be sealed with doors on the ship's bottom, allowing the submarine to be brought up inside the vessel and hidden from view. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was the largest and most sophisticated deep-ocean vessel ever built. Her construction took approximately 2 years and cost more than $350 million. Every aspect of her design was driven by the requirements of the recovery mission, though to outside observers, she appeared to be simply an unusual mining ship equipped for deep-sea operations. But even this remarkable vessel could not perform the recovery alone. The capture vehicle itself, the mechanical claw that would actually grasp the submarine and hold it during the lift, was too large and too sensitive to be assembled in the open where Soviet intelligence satellites might photograph it. For this component of the operation, the CIA commissioned the construction of another unique vessel, the Hughes mining barge, designated HMB-1. The Hughes mining barge was a submersible barge, 324 feet long and 106 feet wide, with a roof that could be retracted while the barge was submerged. The capture vehicle, code-named Clementine, would be assembled inside this barge, completely hidden from overhead observation. When Clementine was complete, the barge would be towed out to sea and submerged. The Hughes Glomar Explorer would position herself over the barge, the barge roof would open, and Clementine would be lifted up into the Explorer's moon pool for integration with the ship's systems. This elaborate procedure was necessary because Soviet reconnaissance satellites regularly photographed American shipyards and naval facilities. Had Clementine been assembled in the open, Soviet analysts would have seen it and might have deduced its true purpose. By keeping the capture vehicle hidden inside a submersible barge until the moment of transfer, the CIA ensured that no one outside the program would see what was really being built. The capture vehicle itself was an engineering marvel. Designed by Lockheed Corporation, Clementine was essentially a giant mechanical claw with multiple articulated fingers designed to wrap around the submarine hull and grip it securely. The system included powerful hydraulic actuators, guidance systems for positioning during the descent, and cameras to allow operators on the surface to see what the vehicle was doing 3 miles below. The development and testing of all these systems took years. Engineers had to solve problems that no one had ever faced before. How do you test a capture vehicle designed to operate at crushing depths? How do you ensure that a lifting system will hold together under loads that would destroy ordinary equipment? The answers often involved extensive simulation, careful analysis, and a great deal of educated guesswork about conditions that could not be precisely replicated in any test facility. Throughout the development process, the cover story was maintained with meticulous care. Global marine personnel who needed to know the true purpose of the project were briefed and sworn to secrecy. Others were told simply that they were working on an experimental deep-sea mining system. Press inquiries about the Hughes Glomar Explorer were handled with vague references to manganese nodule extraction and Howard Hughes's interest in ocean resources. The manganese nodule cover story had an element of genius to it. Deep-sea mining was a genuine emerging industry with real commercial interest. Other companies really were exploring the possibility of harvesting nodules from the seafloor. By positioning the Hughes Glomar Explorer as a mining vessel, the CIA provided a plausible explanation for all the unusual features that might otherwise attract suspicion. Why did the ship have such a large moon pool? For bringing nodules aboard, of course. Why did it have such sophisticated dynamic positioning systems? For maintaining station over mining sites. Why was it going to remote areas of the Pacific? That's where the best nodule fields were located. By early 1974, after years of design, construction, testing, and preparation, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was finally ready for her mission. The capture vehicle had been secretly loaded into the moon pool. The crew had been trained on all the ship's systems. The cover story had been reinforced with media articles about Hughes's deep-sea mining venture. Everything was in place. The submarine K-129 had been resting on the seafloor for 6 years. Her crew had long since been mourned in the Soviet Union, though their families had never learned exactly what had happened or where the submarine lay. Soviet naval authorities had eventually called off the search and concluded that K-129 had been lost with all hands to causes unknown. The Pacific had kept her secrets. Now the Americans were coming to disturb her rest, to attempt something that had never been done before, to reach down 3 miles into the darkness and bring back what they could of the submarine and her crew. The most audacious salvage operation in history was about to begin. The Hughes Glomar Explorer departed Long Beach, California, in June of 1974, beginning the long voyage to the recovery site in the Central Pacific. The crew included both civilians from Global Marine and CIA personnel responsible for the actual recovery operations. The ship made her way across the Pacific at a steady pace, her sophisticated equipment checked and rechecked as she approached the moment of truth. On the 4th of July, 1974, 6 years and nearly 4 months after KA-129 had sunk, the Hughes Glomar Explorer arrived at the recovery site. The American Independence Day seemed an appropriate date to begin what many hoped would be an unprecedented intelligence triumph. Below the ship, more than 16,000 feet down, the broken hull of KA-129 waited in the darkness, holding her secrets and her dead. The operations that followed over the next several weeks would be conducted in total secrecy, hidden from the world beneath the cover of a mining operation, far from any witnesses on the empty Pacific. What happened during those weeks, what was recovered and what was lost, would remain classified for decades. Some aspects remain secret to this day. But before we descend to the seafloor with the Hughes Glomar Explorer, let yourself settle deeper into rest. The story continues, but there is no hurry. The submarine has waited 6 years already. She can wait a little longer while you close your eyes and breathe slowly, letting the gentle motion of imagined waves rock you toward sleep. The Pacific stretches endless and dark, vast beyond imagining, patient and deep. Somewhere below its surface, history waits to be recovered. And here, in the quiet, you wait too, drifting between wakefulness and dreams, between the surface and the depths. Rest now. The story will continue when you're ready. The secrets of the deep have kept for millions of years. They can keep a little longer still. Before we continue with the recovery operation itself, let us linger a moment longer on what had brought this remarkable moment into being, the web of circumstances and decisions that had converged in the waters of the Central Pacific. The world of 1974 was a very different place from our own. The Cold War, now more than a quarter-century old, had settled into a pattern of sustained tension punctuated by periodic crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war, and that near miss had prompted both sides to seek ways of managing their competition without stumbling into catastrophe. Yet the underlying rivalry remained as intense as ever. In this environment, intelligence was paramount. Both superpowers maintained vast networks of spies, analysts, listening posts, and reconnaissance platforms dedicated to understanding what the other side was doing, planning, and capable of achieving. Every piece of information about enemy capabilities, every insight into their technology and intentions, could potentially provide an advantage that might prove decisive if the Cold War ever turned hot. For American intelligence, Soviet submarines represented one of the most important and elusive targets. These vessels could strike with nuclear weapons while remaining hidden beneath the waves. Understanding their capabilities, tracking their movements, and ideally gaining access to their most closely guarded secrets were priorities of the highest order. The discovery that KA-129 lay essentially intact on the Pacific seafloor presented an opportunity unlike any that had come before. The submarine held not only missiles and torpedoes, but also the accumulated technology and documentation of Soviet submarine design and operations. Her cryptographic equipment could reveal how the Soviet Navy communicated with its fleet, potentially allowing American intelligence to read Soviet naval communications. Her construction could reveal the strengths and weaknesses of Soviet submarines, information that would be invaluable to both American submarine designers and the anti-submarine warfare community. But the intelligence value of KA-129 was not the only consideration driving the decision to attempt recovery. The operation represented a statement about American technological capability and determination. If the United States could reach down 3 miles into the ocean and pluck a submarine from the seafloor, what else might be possible? The mere existence of such a capability would give Soviet planners pause, introducing a new element of uncertainty into their calculations. The decision to proceed with Project Azorian was not made lightly or quickly. From the moment USS Halibut photographed the wreck in 1968, it took years of study, planning, and debate before the operation received final authorization. Engineers had to convince decision-makers that recovery was technically feasible. Intelligence analysts had to argue that the potential rewards justified the enormous costs and risks. Security specialists had to develop cover stories and compartmentation schemes that would keep the operation secret. Throughout this process, the possibility of failure loomed large. An unsuccessful recovery attempt would not only waste hundreds of millions of dollars but could also embarrass the United States if the operation became public. The cover story, no matter how carefully constructed, might not hold up to scrutiny. The Soviets might detect the operation and interfere with it, potentially leading to a confrontation in international waters. All of these risks had to be weighed against the potential intelligence windfall. The engineers who designed the recovery system faced challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. Consider the pipe string alone. Imagine a steel pipe more than 3 miles long, hanging vertically in the water, with a capture vehicle and eventually a submarine attached to its bottom end. The weight of this system was astronomical. The stresses on each joint where pipe sections connected were enormous. Any failure anywhere along this immense chain would doom the operation. The capture vehicle, Clementine, had to operate at depths where the pressure exceeded 7,000 pounds per square inch. At such pressures, ordinary mechanical systems would be crushed instantly. Every component, every seal, every moving part had to be designed to function reliably in an environment that no human being could survive. The hydraulic systems that powered the capture vehicle's gripping mechanism had to provide enormous force while operating at these crushing depths, a feat of engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Navigation and positioning presented their own difficulties. How do you guide a capture vehicle to a precise location 3 miles below the surface? The GPS satellite navigation system that we take for granted today did not exist in 1974. Radio waves do not penetrate water effectively, so communication with the capture vehicle had to rely on acoustic signals, which propagate slowly and can be distorted by temperature layers and other oceanographic phenomena. Television cameras mounted on the capture vehicle provided visual guidance, but the images had to travel 3 miles through cables to reach the operators aboard the ship. The lights required to illuminate the seafloor at such depths had to be powerful enough to provide usable images while operating reliably in the high-pressure environment. Every aspect of the system required innovation and careful engineering. The ship itself, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, was unlike any vessel previously constructed. Her dynamic positioning system, which allowed her to maintain station above a precise point on the seafloor, represented state-of-the-art technology. She used a combination of multiple propellers and thrusters, controlled by computers that analyzed data from acoustic beacons on the seafloor, to counteract the forces of wind, waves, and current that would otherwise push her off position. The gimbal mechanism at the heart of the ship's lifting system absorbed the motion of the vessel as she rose and fell with the swells, preventing these movements from being transmitted down the pipe string to the capture vehicle and its cargo. This massive piece of equipment, weighing more than 600 tons, had to function continuously throughout the lifting operation, which would take days or even weeks to complete. The moon pool, the opening in the center of the ship through which operations were conducted, was essentially a giant indoor dock concealed within the vessel's hull. The pool was large enough to accommodate the captured submarine section, allowing the prize to be raised entirely inside the ship where it could be examined without any possibility of observation from outside. The doors that sealed the bottom of the moon pool had to be massive enough to close beneath the raised cargo, strong enough to support its weight, and watertight enough to keep the ocean out of the ship's interior. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire project was that it remained secret for as long as it did. The construction of the Hughes Glomar Explorer took place at a busy commercial shipyard. Hundreds of workers were involved in building and outfitting the vessel. The cover story about deep-sea mining had to be maintained not only for the public but for most of the people actually working on the project, who believed they were building a civilian industrial vessel rather than an intelligence platform. The Global Marine Development Company, which served as the public face of the operation, was a real company with real expertise in offshore oil and gas operations. Its involvement in an ocean mining venture was not inherently suspicious. The manganese nodule story had enough basis in reality that industry observers and journalists generally accepted it at face value. Howard Hughes himself was the perfect frontman precisely because he was so eccentric and unpredictable. If anyone else had announced plans to build a revolutionary deep-sea mining ship, skeptical observers might have demanded proof of the technology's viability or questioned whether the economics made sense. But Howard Hughes was known for pursuing grand, unusual projects regardless of conventional business logic. His name attached to any venture conferred an air of plausibility, or at least of wealthy eccentricity that discouraged close questioning. The compartmentalization of Project Azorian was extraordinarily strict. People working on different aspects of the operation often had no idea how their work fit into the larger picture. Engineers designing components of the capture vehicle might not know what the device was intended to capture. Shipyard workers building sections of the ship might not understand the purpose of the unusual features they were constructing. Only a small number of people at the highest levels of the project had complete knowledge of its true nature. This compartmentalization extended to the government itself. Project Azorian was what the intelligence community calls a special access program, with information restricted to individuals who had been specifically read into the program regardless of their general security clearances. Many senior officials with top-secret clearances had no knowledge of the operation. Even within the CIA, the number of people who knew the full story was strictly limited. The Soviet Union, for its part, seems to have had no inkling of what the Americans were planning. Soviet intelligence was formidable, with networks of agents and technical collection systems that had penetrated many American secrets. Yet Project Azorian apparently evaded detection throughout its planning and construction phases. The Soviets knew that K-129 had been lost, but they did not know where she had sunk, and they apparently did not realize that the Americans had located her wreck and were preparing an extraordinary recovery operation. This intelligence failure on the Soviet side is perhaps understandable given how unlikely the operation seemed. If Soviet analysts had considered the possibility that the Americans might try to recover K-129, they might well have dismissed it as impossible. The depths involved were unprecedented for any salvage operation. The technology required did not exist when the submarine sank. The cost would be astronomical. Why would anyone attempt something so difficult, so expensive, so uncertain of success? The answer, of course, was that the potential rewards were equally unprecedented. The opportunity to examine a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, to study her weapons and communication systems, to analyze her construction and understand her vulnerabilities, this was the kind of intelligence prize that comes along once in a generation. For this prize, the United States was willing to attempt the impossible. The human element of the story should not be overlooked. Project Azorian involved thousands of people over many years, from the engineers who designed its systems to the workers who built its equipment to the crews who operated them. Most of these people never knew the true purpose of their work, but their skill and dedication made the operation possible. The crew of USS Halibut, who had located and photographed the wreck in 1968, conducted their mission under challenging and dangerous conditions. Submarines are inherently hazardous vessels, and operations at the extreme depths required for the K-129 survey pushed the limits of what was considered safe. The information they gathered made everything that followed possible. The designers and builders who created the Hughes Glomar Explorer and its recovery systems worked at the cutting edge of engineering knowledge, solving problems that had never been solved before. The capture vehicle, Clementine, represented years of development work by Lockheed engineers who had to imagine and then build a system capable of functioning in an environment no human being could ever experience directly. The crew of the Hughes Glomar Explorer, both the global marine personnel who operated the ship and the CIA officers who directed the recovery operation, spent weeks at sea in conditions of secrecy and stress that few sailors have ever experienced. They knew that they were attempting something historic, something that had never been done before, and they carried the weight of that knowledge throughout the long days and nights of the operation. And underlying all of this human effort was the submarine itself, KL-129, and the men who had died aboard her. Whatever intelligence value the wreck might hold, whatever technological secrets might be recovered, at the heart of the story were 98 Soviet sailors who had gone to sea in service of their country and never returned. Their final patrol had ended in disaster, in circumstances that remained mysterious even to their own navy. Their families had mourned them without knowing where they had died or why. The Americans who planned and executed Project Azorian never lost sight of this human dimension. The operation was driven by Cold War imperatives and intelligence requirements, but those who participated understood that they were disturbing a grave, reaching into the darkness to retrieve not only secrets but also remains. The decision to bury the recovered Soviet sailors with full military honors reflected this awareness. As the Hughes Glomar Explorer held station over the wreck site in that July of 1974, all of these threads came together. The years of planning and construction, the vast expenditure of resources and human effort, the hopes of the intelligence community and the caution of the skeptics, all of it converged on this moment in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. 3 miles below the ship, K-129 waited in the darkness as she had waited for more than 6 years. Her hull was broken, her compartments flooded, her crew long since departed. But she still held her secrets, her missiles and torpedoes, her cryptographic equipment and construction details, all preserved by the cold and pressure of the deep. The pipe string was prepared for deployment. The capture vehicle was ready. The crew was trained and positioned. Everything that human ingenuity and determination could do had been done. What remained was to find out whether it would be enough, whether the impossible could actually be achieved. In the operation center of the Hughes Glomar Explorer, the command was given to begin deployment. The first sections of pipe began descending through the moon pool, beginning the long journey to the seafloor. Foot by foot, section by section, the capture vehicle descended toward its target, leaving the world of light and warmth for the endless darkness below. The recovery attempt was underway. What had been planned for years, what had been built at such extraordinary cost, what had been kept secret through such elaborate deception, was finally being put to the test. The eyes of the intelligence community, such as knew of the operation, were focused on this ship in the middle of the Pacific, this impossible attempt to reach down and touch the bottom of the world. The Hughes Glomar Explorer held her position above the wreck site, her sophisticated dynamic positioning systems working continuously to keep her stationary despite the currents and swells of the open Pacific. 3 miles below, invisible in the eternal darkness of the deep, K-129 lay broken on the seafloor, unaware that the world above was about to reach down for her. The voyage from Long Beach to the recovery site had taken approximately 2 weeks, crossing thousands of miles of open ocean. The ship had traveled at a steady pace, her crew using the transit time to make final preparations and to rehearse the procedures they would follow during the recovery operation. The mood aboard was one of focused anticipation, an awareness that something historic was about to be attempted. The Pacific Ocean in summer can be deceptively calm. The swells that roll across its surface seem gentle from the perspective of a large ship, barely noticeable compared to the storms that can make winter crossings so challenging. But even these modest waves represented a complication for the recovery operation. The ship would rise and fall with each swell, potentially jerking on the pipe string and capture vehicle far below. The gimbal mechanism was designed to absorb this motion, but no system is perfect. Any unexpected movement could damage equipment or, worse, cause the captured submarine to slip from the mechanical grip that would hold it. As the Hughes Glomar Explorer approached the recovery site, the crew deployed acoustic transponders to mark the precise location of the wreck on the seafloor. These devices would serve as reference points, allowing the ship's navigation systems to maintain position relative to the target with an accuracy of a few feet. The wreck's location had been determined with precision by USS Halibut 6 years earlier, but confirming that location and establishing the reference points required for recovery operations was essential before the actual attempt could begin. The seafloor in this part of the Pacific slopes gently, a vast abyssal plain covered with fine sediment that accumulates over millions of years. The submarine had come to rest on this slope, her hull oriented in a particular direction determined by the currents and forces that had acted on her as she descended through the water column after the casualty. The photographs from Halibut showed the wreck lying at a slight angle, the bow section pointed somewhat upward from the surrounding sediment. Understanding the exact position and orientation of the wreck was crucial for planning the capture. The capture vehicle had to approach from the correct direction and position its gripping mechanism precisely to ensure a secure hold. Any error in this positioning could result in an unstable grip that might fail during the lift, or in damage to the submarine that could cause valuable intelligence materials to be lost. Inside the ship, the operations center hummed with activity. Banks of monitors displayed data from sensors throughout the vessel and from equipment already deployed below the surface. Engineers studied readouts, technicians checked connections, and CIA officers coordinated the carefully planned sequence of events that would unfold over the coming days. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the culmination of 6 years of planning, design, and construction. The atmosphere in the operations center was tense but controlled. The men gathered there were professionals, selected for this mission because of their expertise and their ability to perform under pressure. Many had spent years working toward this moment, developing the technology, testing the systems, preparing for the challenges they were about to face. Yet no amount of preparation could eliminate the anxiety of actually attempting something that had never been done before. The pipe string that would lower the capture vehicle to the seafloor was a marvel of engineering in its own right. Each section was approximately 60 feet long, made of high-strength steel designed to withstand the enormous tensile loads that would be imposed during the lift. The sections were stored in racks throughout the ship and would be connected one to another as the string descended, each joint carefully made and tested before the next section was added. The process of assembling and lowering the pipe string was necessarily slow. Each connection had to be perfect. A single failed joint anywhere along the more than 16,000-foot length could doom the operation. The crew worked methodically, following procedures that had been developed over years of preparation, checking and rechecking each step before proceeding to the next. The descent of the pipe string through the moon pool created an eerie spectacle for those watching. The great steel pipes disappeared into the dark water one section at a time, swallowed by the Pacific as they began their 3-mile journey to the bottom. The water in the moon pool was dark and cold, illuminated only by the work lights mounted around its perimeter. It was difficult to imagine what lay at the other end of that growing chain of steel, difficult to visualize the wreck waiting in the absolute darkness of the deep. As the pipe string lengthened, the stresses on the system increased. The weight hanging below the ship grew with each added section. The gimbal mechanism worked continuously, absorbing the ship's motion and preventing it from being transmitted down the pipe string. Monitoring systems tracked the loads and stresses throughout the structure, alerting operators to any readings that might indicate developing problems. The descent took days. Each section of pipe had to be carefully connected to the string, tested, and lowered into the water. The process could not be rushed without risking equipment failure or loss of control. All the while, the ship maintained her cover as a mining vessel, ready to explain her presence if any passing ships inquired. The Pacific in this region is not a heavily trafficked part of the ocean. The recovery site was far from shipping lanes, far from any land, in a part of the ocean where commercial vessels had little reason to venture. Nevertheless, the operators aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer remained alert for any approaching vessels that might take an interest in their activities. As it happened, the Pacific in this region was not entirely empty. During the recovery operation, a Soviet naval vessel approached the Hughes Glomar Explorer. The tense moment tested the cover story to its limits. Was the Soviet ship there by coincidence, or had Moscow somehow learned what the Americans were doing? Had a spy revealed the mission, or had Soviet intelligence simply noticed the unusual vessel and come to investigate? The approach of the Soviet ship created an immediate crisis in the operations center. All the careful planning, all the elaborate cover stories, all the years of secrecy, everything came down to whether the cover would hold under direct Soviet scrutiny. The CIA officers aboard conferred quickly about how to respond. The decision was made to maintain the cover story and continue operations as normally as possible, treating the Soviet approach as the routine curiosity of a passing vessel rather than a targeted intelligence operation. The Hughes Glomar Explorer's cover identity as a mining ship was maintained throughout the encounter. If the Soviets asked questions by radio, the responses would be straightforward: "We're conducting deep-sea mining research, exploring the feasibility of harvesting manganese nodules from the seafloor." This was exactly the kind of work that Howard Hughes might be interested in, exactly the kind of unusual venture that his organization was known for pursuing. The Soviet ship apparently accepted the cover story, or at least had no grounds to challenge it directly. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was operating in international waters, far from any Soviet territorial claims. Mining the ocean floor was a legitimate commercial activity. After a period of observation, the Soviet vessel departed, leaving the Americans to continue their work. Whether the Soviets suspected anything more than was visible on the surface remains unclear to this day. The encounter with the Soviet ship must have been a sobering moment for everyone aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer. It demonstrated how vulnerable the operation was to discovery, how easily years of preparation could be undone by an encounter with Soviet forces. Yet the cover had held. The Soviet ship had departed without interfering. The operation could continue. The relief that followed the Soviet vessel's departure was tempered by the knowledge that the most challenging phase of the operation still lay ahead. The pipe string continued its descent, section by section, foot by foot, carrying the capture vehicle ever closer to its target. The tension aboard the ship, already high, increased with each passing hour. Finally, after days of careful descent, the cameras on Clementine showed the seafloor approaching. The lights mounted on the capture vehicle illuminated a landscape that had never been seen by human eyes, a dark expanse of sediment stretching into the blackness. The fine particles that covered the seafloor stirred slightly as the capture vehicle descended, disturbed by the currents created by its movement. And there, caught in the camera lights, was the wreck of KS-129. The image that appeared on the monitors in the operations center was both historical and haunting. The submarine lay on the seafloor, her hull broken and damaged, her form distorted by the catastrophe that had ended her final patrol. The photographs taken by USS Halibut 6 years earlier had prepared the operations team for what they would see, but there is something different about a live image, something more immediate and compelling. The submarine had been photographed by USS Halibut 6 years earlier, but those images had been taken by a towed camera system with limited capabilities. Now, for the first time, operators aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer could see the wreck in real time, transmitted from cameras mere feet away from the hull. The images were haunting. The Soviet submarine lay broken on the seafloor, her hull crushed in places, her sail structure heavily damaged, her secrets and her dead waiting in the silence of the deep. The damage to the submarine was extensive. The sail area, which housed the 3 ballistic missiles, showed evidence of catastrophic failure. A large hole behind the conning tower indicated where an explosion had torn through the pressure hull. The forward section of the submarine, which was the primary target for recovery, appeared to be largely intact, but the structural integrity of the entire wreck was clearly compromised. The operators carefully maneuvered Clementine into position over the target section of the wreck. This was one of the most delicate phases of the operation. The capture vehicle had to be positioned precisely, its enormous mechanical fingers aligned with the submarine's hull so they could grip securely. Any misalignment might result in an unstable grip that could fail during the lift. The capture vehicle moved slowly, guided by commands from operators watching the video feed in the operations center. Small adjustments, minute corrections, the patient work of positioning a massive piece of machinery in an environment where no human being could survive to make direct observations. The camera showed the wreck from multiple angles, allowing the operators to build up a 3-dimensional understanding of its position and orientation. The positioning took time. The capture vehicle had limited maneuverability, and the currents at depth, though slight, were enough to complicate the task. Operators worked the controls carefully, making small adjustments, watching the cameras, communicating constantly with engineers monitoring the structural loads throughout the system. The tension was extraordinary. Years of work, hundreds of millions of dollars, the hopes of the intelligence community, all came down to whether they could get these mechanical fingers in the right place. Hours passed. The capture vehicle inched into position. The operators grew tired but maintained their focus, knowing that a single mistake could ruin everything. Coffee cups accumulated in the operations center. Men worked in shifts, but the core team remained at their stations, unwilling to step away during this critical phase. Finally, the capture vehicle was positioned to the satisfaction of the operations team. The mechanical fingers were aligned with the submarine's hull. The telemetry showed that all systems were functioning normally. The moment had come to attempt the capture. The command was given, and the massive gripping mechanism began to close around the submarine's hull. Hydraulic systems, designed to operate at pressures that would crush ordinary equipment, drove the fingers closed with inexorable force. The grip tightened, and the capture vehicle held the submarine in its mechanical embrace. The monitors showed the fingers closing, wrapping around the hull, taking hold of the prize that had waited so long in the darkness. The structural sensors reported the loads being transferred as the capture vehicle took the weight of the submarine section. Everything was proceeding as designed. Now came the lift. This was the moment of maximum danger, the point where the operation was most likely to fail. The submarine and capture vehicle together weighed thousands of tons. This entire mass had to be raised 3 miles through the water column without exceeding the structural limits of the lifting system or losing grip on the prize. The lift began slowly, incrementally. The pipe string took up the load gradually, the gimbal mechanism working to absorb the stresses. Aboard the ship, engineers monitored every sensor, watching for any sign that the loads were exceeding design limits. The winches turned, the pipe string shortened, and the capture vehicle began to rise from the seafloor. The first few feet of lift were the most critical. This was when the full weight of the submarine would first be taken up by the capture vehicle's grip. If the grip was going to fail, it would most likely fail during these initial moments when the stresses were first applied. The operators watched the monitors intensely, looking for any sign of slippage or structural failure. The submarine began to rise from the seafloor, ascending through the darkness that had been her tomb for 6 years. Sediment stirred as she lifted free, a cloud of fine particles disturbed by her movement after years of stillness. The camera showed the wreck emerging from the seafloor, rising into the dark water above. The initial lift was successful. The capture vehicle's grip held. The submarine was rising. A collective breath was released in the operations center, a moment of relief quickly tempered by the knowledge that the hardest part was yet to come. 3 miles of ascent lay ahead, 3 miles of stress and uncertainty before the prize would be secure inside the ship. For days, the lift continued. The pipe string was shortened section by section as it was recovered aboard the ship, raising the capture vehicle and its cargo foot by foot toward the surface. The process could not be rushed. Any sudden movement, any jerk or shock to the system, might cause the submarine to break free or the equipment to fail. Patience was essential. The ascent was agonizingly slow. Each section of pipe recovered represented only 60 feet of progress. The capture vehicle and its cargo were rising at a rate of about 1 foot per second, which sounds fast until you realize that 3 miles is nearly 16,000 feet. The math was simple but sobering. Even at this rate, the lift would take hours upon hours. The crew rotated through shifts, but the core operations team remained alert throughout. Sleep was grabbed in brief intervals, meals eaten quickly at workstations. The tension never eased. Every moment brought the possibility that something might go wrong, that the submarine might slip from the capture vehicle's grip, that a joint in the pipe string might fail, that some unanticipated problem might emerge from the depths. As the capture vehicle rose through the water column, the pressure decreased. The submarine had sunk in water where the pressure exceeded 7,000 pounds per square inch. With each 100 feet of ascent, the pressure dropped. The submarine's hull, designed to operate at depth, was now experiencing conditions different from those it had known for 6 years. Air trapped in sealed compartments might expand. Structural members weakened by damage and corrosion might fail under the changing conditions. Then, approximately 1/3 of the way to the surface, disaster struck. The camera showed something that made heart sink throughout the operations center. Part of the submarine's hull was breaking away from the section held by the capture vehicle. Structural members were failing, pieces were falling off, and a significant portion of the wreck was slipping from Clementine's grip. The operators could do nothing but watch as the submarine came apart. The capture vehicle had been designed to grip the hull securely, but the wreck had been weakened by the explosion that sank her and by 6 years of corrosion and pressure on the seafloor. The stresses of the lift were more than some of the damaged structure could bear. On the monitors, the disaster unfolded in silent, terrible clarity. Large sections of the submarine, including much of the sail structure and the area containing the ballistic missiles, broke free from the grip of the capture vehicle. The freed sections began their long fall back to the seafloor, tumbling through the dark water, disappearing from camera view as they descended. The failure was catastrophic for the operation's primary objectives. The sections breaking away included precisely the areas that contained the most valuable intelligence: the R-21 missiles with their nuclear warheads, the communications and cryptographic equipment that might have been stored in the sail area, potentially the code books and operational documents that were among the most coveted targets. The fall of the submarine sections back to the seafloor was captured by the cameras on the capture vehicle. The footage showed the broken pieces tumbling through the dark water, growing smaller and smaller as they descended, until they disappeared entirely into the blackness below. Somewhere far beneath, they would strike the bottom again, scattering across the sediment, coming to rest at depths even greater than where the submarine had originally lain. In the operations center, the mood shifted from tense anticipation to devastation. Years of planning, hundreds of millions of dollars, the hopes of the intelligence community, all of it had literally fallen away into the darkness. The men who had worked so hard to make this moment possible could only watch as their prize slipped from their grasp. Yet the capture vehicle had not released everything. Clementine's mechanical fingers still held a portion of the submarine's bow section. The grip had not failed entirely. Some of what had been grasped remained secure. The question now was whether to continue the lift with what remained or to attempt some kind of rescue of the fallen sections. The answer was clear to the operations team. there was no capability to recover the sections that had fallen. They were descending through thousands of feet of water, and by the time they reached the bottom, they would be scattered across the seafloor far from the original wreck site. Attempting to retrieve them would require starting the entire recovery operation from scratch, with no guarantee of success and the near certainty that the structural damage would only be worse the second time. The decision was made to continue with what they had. The remaining section of the submarine, approximately 38 feet of bow structure, was worth recovering. Even this fragment might contain valuable intelligence. More importantly, continuing the lift was the only way to salvage anything from the operation at all. According to official accounts, approximately 2/3 of what Clementine had grappled fell back to the seafloor. The section that broke away reportedly included much of the sail structure and the missile compartment, precisely the areas that had been of greatest intelligence interest. The R-21 missiles with their nuclear warheads, the code books and cryptographic equipment that might have been stored in the submarine's communication spaces, all of this plunged back into the darkness, coming to rest on the seafloor far below. What remained in Clementine's grip was the forward section of the submarine, approximately 38 feet of the bow. This section was far smaller than what the operation had hoped to recover, but it was not worthless. Even this fragment might contain valuable intelligence about Soviet submarine construction techniques, torpedo weapons, and other systems. The decision was made to continue the lift with what remained. Abandoning the partial recovery would mean the entire operation had been for nothing. At least by bringing up the bow section, the project would salvage something from the disaster. The lift continued, more slowly now, more carefully, as the damaged cargo ascended through the miles of water toward the surface. After additional days of painstaking work, the capture vehicle finally rose into the Hughes Glomar Explorer's moon pool. The great doors on the ship's bottom closed beneath it, sealing the prize inside the vessel and hiding it from any observation. For the first time since Ka-129 sank, part of the submarine was above water, enclosed within the hull of the American vessel. What the recovery team found when they examined their prize was both valuable and tragic. The bow section contained the remains of 6 Soviet sailors. These men had died when their submarine sank 6 years earlier, their bodies preserved in the cold darkness of the deep. They had served their country, followed their orders, and met their end far from home in circumstances that remained mysterious even to their own navy. The recovery team treated the remains with respect from the first moment. These were sailors, men who had gone to sea as the American crew had gone to sea, serving their nation in the demanding and dangerous world of submarine operations. The Cold War had made them adversaries, but death had made them fellow voyagers on the ultimate journey that all human beings eventually take. The bodies had been preserved by the cold and the pressure and the isolation of the deep. The environment 3 miles beneath the Pacific is hostile to life in any form, but it is also an environment that slows the processes of decay. The sailors' remains were recognizable as human, as men, as individuals who had lived and served and died. Examination of the recovered remains provided some information, though exactly what was learned has never been fully disclosed. Identity discs and personal effects helped establish who some of the sailors were. The positions of the remains within the submarine section provided clues about what they might have been doing when catastrophe struck. Every piece of information helped build a picture of K-129's final moments. The recovered section also contained 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, confirming that K-129 had been carrying nuclear weapons when she sank. Some reports indicate that portions of cryptographic equipment were recovered as well, though the details remain classified. What is known is that the section that fell back to the seafloor contained the items of greatest intelligence value, the ballistic missiles, the main code books, and presumably the bulk of the submarine's most sensitive materials. In an objective sense, Project Azorian was a failure. The primary intelligence targets, the missiles and their nuclear warheads, the cryptographic materials, the communications equipment, had not been recovered. The hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the operation had produced only a fragment of the submarine, valuable for what it revealed about Soviet construction techniques but not the intelligence bonanza that had been hoped for. Yet even in failure, Project Azorian remained one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the Cold War. The Hughes Glomar Explorer had done something that no ship had ever done before. She had lowered a capture vehicle to the ocean floor 3 miles down, grasped an object weighing thousands of tons, and lifted it toward the surface. That the recovery was only partially successful took nothing away from the unprecedented nature of the technical accomplishment. The decision about what to do with the recovered Soviet sailors required careful consideration. These men were enemies in the Cold War sense, citizens of a nation locked in ideological and strategic competition with the United States. But they were also human beings who had served their country and died in its service. Their families in the Soviet Union had never learned what happened to them or where their loved ones had come to rest. The leadership of Project Azorian decided to bury the recovered sailors at sea with full military honors. In September 1974, approximately 90 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii, a solemn ceremony was conducted aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer. The 6 Soviet sailors were placed in a steel chamber, their bodies prepared with appropriate dignity. American personnel conducted the burial service, offering prayers for the dead in both English and Russian. The Soviet national anthem was played as the chamber was committed to the sea. The ceremony reflected a code of honor that transcends national boundaries and political systems. Sailors of all nations share a common bond, an understanding of the sea's dangers and the sacrifices made by those who venture upon it. These Soviet sailors had died in service to their country, far from home, in circumstances that brought them into conflict with the United States. But in death, they deserved the dignity accorded to all who serve. The crew members of the Hughes Glomar Explorer who participated in or witnessed the ceremony never forgot it. Many would later describe it as one of the most moving experiences of their lives. In the midst of a covert intelligence operation, in the middle of the Cold War, American sailors had paused to honor Soviet dead with the traditions and ceremonies that bind all seafarers together. The steel chamber containing the remains was weighted and prepared for the descent. The ceremonies complete, the chamber was lowered over the side and released. It sank into the Pacific, carrying the 6 sailors to their final rest in the deep waters southwest of Hawaii. They had been recovered from one ocean grave only to be placed in another, but this time with the knowledge and respect of those who had found them. The ceremony was filmed. The footage shows a brief but dignified service, American military personnel standing at attention as the remains of Soviet sailors are sent to their final rest. The juxtaposition is striking, the height of the Cold War, 2 superpowers threatening each other with nuclear annihilation, and yet these Americans taking the time to honor enemy dead with the respect due to sailors who had given their lives in service. The video recording of this burial was classified and stored away, unseen by the Soviet Union or the families of the dead sailors. It would remain hidden for nearly 2 decades, a secret testament to a moment of humanity in the midst of an intelligence operation. After the recovery operation concluded, the Hughes Glomar Explorer returned to port and was placed in storage. The vast expense of the operation and its limited success made a second recovery attempt seem impractical. The section of K-129 that had fallen back to the seafloor would remain there, along with the missiles, the codes, and the remains of most of her crew. For several months, Project Azorian remained secret. The cover story about deep-sea mining had held, and the operation had been conducted without the Soviet Union or the American public learning what had really happened. The CIA had pulled off one of the most ambitious covert operations in history and, despite the limited recovery, had demonstrated capabilities that were genuinely revolutionary. Then, in February 1975, the secret began to unravel. The previous June, burglars had broken into the headquarters of the Hughes organization in Los Angeles, stealing documents that apparently included materials related to the Glomar Explorer project. These documents made their way to journalists, who began investigating the story. When the Los Angeles Times indicated that it intended to publish an article about the CIA's submarine recovery operation, the agency went into damage control mode. Director of Central Intelligence William Colby personally appealed to media executives, asking them to hold the story on national security grounds. He argued that publication might prompt the Soviet Union to return to the wreck site and recover the portion of the submarine still on the seafloor, potentially including sensitive American equipment that had been left behind. Colby's appeals revealed the extent of the government's concern about public disclosure. The CIA had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars on this operation. Even though the recovery had been only partially successful, the capabilities demonstrated remained valuable. If the Soviets learned the full details of what the Americans had accomplished, they might take steps to improve the security of their own submarines, reduce their vulnerability to future recovery attempts, or even mount their own expedition to the wreck site to retrieve what remained. The appeals also illustrated the complicated relationship between government secrecy and press freedom that has characterized American democracy throughout its history. The media has a responsibility to inform the public about government activities, but that responsibility sometimes conflicts with legitimate national security concerns. Different editors and publishers weighed these considerations differently, reaching different conclusions about whether to publish. For a time, this appeal worked. Several major news organizations agreed to delay publication. The New York Times, The Washington Post, and other leading outlets held the story, accepting the CIA's argument that publication could harm national security. But the story was too significant to remain suppressed indefinitely. In February 1975, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh of the New York Times had gathered extensive information about the project. When the Los Angeles Times published a brief initial story, the New York Times followed with more detailed reporting. By March, syndicated columnist Jack Anderson was discussing the operation on national television. The public revelation of Project Azorian was a sensation. The idea that the CIA had secretly built a massive ship, lowered a giant claw 3 miles to the ocean floor, and attempted to steal a Soviet submarine captured the imagination of the American public. The story seemed like something from a spy novel or a science fiction film, almost too audacious to be true. The Soviet Union reacted with officially expressed outrage, but notably did not take certain actions that might have been expected. Moscow did not demand the return of the recovered submarine section or the remains of the Soviet sailors. Some analysts interpreted this restraint as indicating that the Soviets preferred not to draw more attention to the incident or acknowledge the extent of what the Americans had learned about their submarine. In the aftermath of the disclosure, a journalist named Harriet and Philippi filed a Freedom of Information Act request seeking CIA documents related to the project, including records of the agency's attempts to suppress media coverage. The CIA's response to this request created a legal doctrine that has become one of the agency's most enduring legacies, arguably more famous than Project Azorian itself. The CIA refused to confirm or deny the existence of any records relating to the project. The agency argued that acknowledging the existence of such records, or acknowledging that no such records existed, would itself reveal classified information about the nature and extent of CIA involvement in the operation. This response came to be known as the Glomar response, taking its name from the ship that had been at the center of the operation. Philippi challenged this response in court, and the case worked its way through the federal judiciary. The courts ultimately upheld the CIA's position, establishing the legal principle that government agencies could, under appropriate circumstances, refuse to confirm or deny the existence of records when even that acknowledgement would compromise classified information. The Glomar response has since become a standard tool in government responses to sensitive Freedom of Information Act requests. When agencies invoke the Glomar Doctrine, they are using a legal precedent that traces directly back to the Hughes Glomar Explorer and the underwater operation she was built to perform. In a peculiar way, the project's most lasting legacy may not be the intelligence recovered from K-129, but rather the legal doctrine born from the attempt to keep the operation secret. The Glomar response illustrates how covert operations can have unintended consequences that extend far beyond their original scope. The CIA officers who planned and executed Project Azorian were focused on intelligence gathering and operational security. They were not thinking about creating new legal doctrines. Yet the legal battles that followed the operation's disclosure created precedents that continue to shape the relationship between government secrecy and public accountability. Critics of the Glomar response argue that it gives government agencies too much latitude to withhold information from the public. By refusing even to confirm or deny the existence of records, agencies can effectively shield their activities from any public scrutiny. Supporters counter that some secrets are genuinely important to national security and that agencies must be able to protect them. The debate over government secrecy is as old as representative government itself. Democracies require informed citizens to function properly, yet governments also have legitimate secrets that could harm the nation if disclosed. Finding the right balance between transparency and security is a challenge that every democratic society must address. The Glomar response is one attempt at that balance, though opinions differ about whether it strikes the right one. The Hughes Glomar Explorer herself had an afterlife following Project Azorian. The ship was too valuable and too capable to simply be scrapped. After the project ended, she was mothballed by the Navy in 1976, preserved in case she might be needed for future operations. In the 1990s, the ship was leased and eventually sold to private companies for use as a deepwater drilling vessel. She was converted for oil and gas exploration, her moon pool and lifting systems adapted for lowering drilling equipment rather than capture vehicles. Renamed GSF Explorer and later various other names as she changed ownership, the former intelligence vessel spent the final decades of her career drilling in some of the deepest waters in the world. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was finally retired and towed to China for scrapping in 2015. The remarkable vessel that had attempted one of the most audacious intelligence operations in history ended her days being cut apart for scrap metal. But her legacy, in the form of the Glomar response and the story of Project Azorian, continues. The Hughes mining barge, HMB-1, also had a second life. After Project Azorian, the submersible barge was mothballed at Todd Shipyard in San Francisco until 1982, when it was reactivated for use in another classified program, the construction of the Sea Shadow, an experimental stealth ship developed by Lockheed and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Like Clementine before it, the Sea Shadow was built inside the Hughes mining barge, hidden from overhead surveillance. The barge's ability to submerge and conceal its contents proved valuable once again for a secret naval program. The Sea Shadow was eventually revealed to the public, and the Hughes mining barge was sold in 2012 for $2.5 million, refitted as an enclosed dry dock in Alameda, California. In October 1992, nearly 2 decades after the burial at sea, Director of Central Intelligence Robert Gates visited Moscow to meet with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Gates brought with him the Soviet naval flag that had draped the coffins of the 6 sailors recovered from K-129, along with the videotape of their burial ceremony. The decision to share this material with Russia represented a significant gesture of goodwill in the new post-Cold War relationship between the former adversaries. The Soviet Union had collapsed just months earlier, and the United States was working to build a cooperative relationship with Russia. Offering information about Soviet sailors lost during the Cold War was a way of demonstrating that the hostility of the past need not define the future. For the Russian government and the families of the K-129 crew, the video provided closure that had been denied for decades. The families had never known exactly what happened to their loved ones or where they had come to rest. Now, at least for 6 of the 98 lost sailors, there was an answer. They had been found, treated with respect, and buried with honor, even by an adversary nation. The ceremony captured on that video transcends the politics and strategic calculations that otherwise dominated the story of Project Azorian. Whatever one thinks about the operation, whatever assessments one makes about its costs and benefits, the moment when American sailors honored Soviet dead with full military rights represents something fundamentally human. It is a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, even when nations threaten each other with annihilation, individuals can recognize the common humanity that unites all people. This gesture was part of American efforts to build a new relationship with Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The United States was seeking Russian cooperation in resolving questions about American prisoners of war and missing servicemen, and offering information about Soviet sailors lost on K-129 was seen as a way to encourage reciprocity. Gates later wrote about bringing the video recording to Yeltsin, a dignified and respectful service even at the height of the Cold War. The tape showed American sailors standing at attention, prayers being offered in 2 languages, and the Soviet anthem playing as their comrades were committed to the sea. It was a moment of shared humanity in a story otherwise dominated by secrecy and strategic competition. The Russian government eventually showed portions of the burial video to relatives of the K-129 crew, providing some measure of closure to families who had waited decades to learn anything about what had happened to their loved ones. The video demonstrated that at least 6 of the 98 men lost had been recovered and buried with honor, even if the full circumstances of the submarine's loss remained unclear. President Yeltsin posthumously awarded the Medal for Courage to all 98 sailors who died on K-129. However, questions arose when it was noted that the standard complement of a Gulf-class submarine was approximately 83 men. The award to 98 sailors suggested that 15 additional personnel had been aboard for this particular patrol, a fact that has never been fully explained by Russian naval authorities. The cause of K-129 sinking has never been definitively established. The official Soviet Navy hypothesis was that the submarine, while operating in snorkel mode, slipped below her safe operating depth due to a malfunction or crew error, resulting in flooding that sank the boat. Other theories have been proposed over the years, including hydrogen explosion in the battery compartment, missile explosion caused by a leaking missile tube seal, and collision with an American submarine. Submarines, for all their technological sophistication, remain inherently dangerous vessels. They operate in an environment hostile to human life, separated from the crushing pressures of the deep by only a layer of metal and machinery. When something goes wrong aboard a submarine, the consequences can be catastrophic, with little time for the crew to respond or escape. The diesel-electric submarines of K-129's era faced particular hazards related to their battery systems. The lead-acid batteries that powered these vessels when submerged could produce hydrogen gas if improperly managed. Hydrogen is highly explosive, and an explosion in the battery compartment of a submarine could easily breach the pressure hull, leading to rapid flooding and sinking. The liquid-fueled missiles that K-129 carried presented their own dangers. Unlike the solid-fueled missiles developed by the United States, Soviet ballistic missiles of this period used hypergolic propellants that were highly toxic and corrosive. Handling these propellants required extreme care, and any leak or spill could have devastating consequences. The propellants could react violently if they came into contact with each other or with seawater. The collision theory has been particularly persistent among Russian naval officers and officials, who have suggested that the American submarine USS Swordfish was responsible for sinking K-129. The Swordfish did put into Yokosuka, Japan, shortly after K-129 disappeared, reportedly for repairs to a damaged periscope. American officials have categorically denied any collision, stating that no American submarine was within 300 nautical miles of K-129 when she sank. The photographs taken by USS Halibut and the examination of the recovered bow section provided some evidence about what might have happened. A 10-foot hole was observed behind the conning tower, suggesting an explosion in the missile compartment area. The damage pattern was consistent with a catastrophic failure of one of the R-21 missiles, possibly triggered by a leak in a missile tube hatch seal. In 1986, the Soviet submarine K-219 suffered exactly this type of accident in the Atlantic Ocean. A leaking missile tube seal allowed seawater to contact missile propellant, causing an explosion that ultimately led to the submarine's loss. The similarity suggests that the Soviet liquid-fueled missile system had an inherent vulnerability that may have claimed K-129 18 years earlier. Whatever the cause, K-129 and most of her crew remain on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, more than 16,000 feet below the surface. The section that broke away during the recovery attempt, including the missiles and presumably the remains of most of the crew, has never been recovered. Soviet and later Russian naval authorities have never mounted their own recovery effort. The story of Project Azorian raises profound questions about the lengths nations will go to in pursuit of intelligence advantages. The operation cost approximately $800 million in 1970s currency, equivalent to more than $5 billion today. It required the construction of unique vessels, the development of unprecedented technology, and the maintenance of an elaborate cover story for years. All of this was undertaken for the chance to examine a single submarine that had already been on the seafloor for 6 years. The decision to proceed with such an expensive and risky operation reflected the priorities of the Cold War era. Intelligence about Soviet capabilities was considered invaluable, worth almost any price if it could provide a strategic advantage. The ability to examine a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, even one that had been lost years earlier, offered insights that could not be obtained any other way. The operation also demonstrated the remarkable capabilities that the United States could bring to bear when national security was perceived to be at stake. The engineering achievements of Project Azorian were genuinely unprecedented. The Hughes Glomar Explorer and her capture vehicle represented the cutting edge of what human technology could accomplish in the ocean depths. Yet the outcome of the operation also illustrated the limits of even the most sophisticated technology. Despite years of planning, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the best engineering minds available, the recovery was only partially successful. The submarine broke apart, the most valuable targets fell back to the seafloor, and most of what the operation had hoped to achieve remained beyond reach. Was it worth it? The answer depends on what value one places on intelligence information versus human life, on technological advancement versus the resources expended to achieve it. The operation did not recover the primary targets, the missiles and codes that had been the main objectives. What was learned from the recovered bow section remains largely classified. Yet the operation demonstrated capabilities that had never existed before. The Hughes Glomar Explorer proved that objects could be recovered from ocean depths previously thought unreachable for practical salvage work. The technologies developed for Project Azorian advanced the state-of-the-art in deep ocean operations in ways that have had applications far beyond intelligence gathering. Perhaps most importantly, Project Azorian demonstrated the remarkable lengths to which Cold War intelligence services would go in pursuit of their objectives. The creativity, the engineering audacity, the sheer determination required to attempt such an operation reveal something about the intensity of the superpower competition that defined that era. Nothing was considered impossible if it might provide an advantage over the adversary. The men and women who planned, built, and executed Project Azorian represent a remarkable chapter in the history of American engineering and intelligence work. Most of them never received public recognition for their achievements. The operation remained classified for years, and even after disclosure, many details remained secret. The engineers who solved unprecedented technical problems, the sailors who operated in conditions of extreme secrecy, the analysts who pieced together the clues that made the operation possible, all of them worked in obscurity, knowing that their accomplishments might never be acknowledged. This is the nature of intelligence work. The greatest successes often remain unknown, while the failures become public scandals. The people who dedicate their careers to gathering intelligence and protecting national security accept this asymmetry as part of their service. They work not for glory but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they have contributed to their nation's security. Project Azorian, for all its ultimate limitations, represented a genuine achievement in this tradition. The operation pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible, demonstrated capabilities that had never existed before, and provided at least some intelligence value despite the partial failure of the recovery. The men who attempted it, from the highest levels of government to the crew members who operated the equipment, can take pride in what they accomplished. The Cold War ended more than 3 decades ago. The Soviet Union no longer exists, and Russia, its primary successor state, maintains a very different relationship with the United States than the one that existed when K-129 sailed on her final patrol. The strategic nuclear competition continues in modified form, but the ideological confrontation that gave the Cold War its particular character has faded into history. The submarines of both nations still patrol the world's oceans, carrying missiles that could end civilization. The deterrent logic that drove the construction of K-129 and her sisters still operates, though the political context has changed. Sailors still go to sea in submarines, spending weeks submerged, maintaining readiness for a war that everyone hopes will never come. The world has changed dramatically since 1968. Technology has advanced beyond what the engineers who built the Hughes Glomar Explorer could have imagined. Computers that once filled entire rooms now fit in our pockets. Satellites provide navigation accurate to within feet. Communication systems span the globe instantaneously. Yet the fundamental challenge of submarine warfare remains largely the same: finding an enemy vessel that does not want to be found, somewhere in the vastness of the global ocean. Modern submarines are quieter, faster, and more capable than K-129 could ever have been. They carry missiles with far greater range and accuracy. Their crews can operate submerged for months at a time, limited only by food supplies. But they face the same essential truth that confronted the crew of K-129: the ocean is vast, unforgiving, and keeps its secrets well. The story of Project Azorian offers lessons that remain relevant today. It demonstrates what determined nations can accomplish when they commit resources to solving seemingly impossible problems. It shows the importance of intelligence in strategic competition and the lengths that nations will go to obtain it. And it reminds us that behind every strategic calculation are human beings, people who serve and sometimes die in service to causes larger than themselves. Far below the surface of the Pacific, in the eternal darkness where light never reaches, the remains of K-129 rest in silence. The men who sailed on her final voyage have been gone for more than half a century now. Most of their families have likely passed away as well, the grief of their loss fading with the generations. The submarine and her dead have become part of the ocean floor, slowly being covered by the sediment that drifts down from the waters above. The seafloor at such depths is a place of absolute stillness. No current strong enough to disturb the sediment, no light to illuminate the darkness, no sound except the slow creaking of the Earth's crust and the occasional passage of a deep-diving creature. The submarine lies there in this timeless environment, her hull slowly corroding, her structure gradually yielding to the pressure and the chemistry of the deep ocean. The portion of the submarine that fell back during the recovery attempt came to rest nearby, scattered across the seafloor slope. The missiles and their nuclear warheads, the cryptographic equipment, the personal effects of the crew, all of it lies there still, preserved by the cold and the darkness, waiting. Waiting for what? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the ocean will simply claim it all, slowly, over centuries and millennia, breaking it down until nothing remains to mark the place where 92 sailors came to rest. The bodies of most of the crew remain with the submarine. Only 6 were recovered and given the honor of burial with military rites. The others lie with their ship, their final post, their eternal patrol. Submarine sailors understand that the sea may claim them. They accept this risk when they go down the hatch and seal it behind them. The men of K-129 paid that price, and the Pacific has kept their trust. But their story endures. The tale of K-129 and Project Azorian has been told in books, documentaries, and accounts like this one. It is a story of Cold War intrigue and engineering achievement, of secrets kept and secrets revealed, of men who died in service to their country and those who tried, years later, to recover what they could from the deep. The narrative of K-129 and Project Azorian touches on themes that resonate far beyond the specific events it describes. It speaks to the human drive to push against the limits of what is possible, to reach into environments hostile to life and bring back knowledge. It illustrates the complex moral calculations that nations make when pursuing strategic advantage, weighing costs against benefits in circumstances where the stakes are impossibly high. The story also reminds us of the personal dimension that underlies all grand historical events. K-129 was not merely a collection of metal and machinery. She was a vessel crewed by men with families and hopes and fears, men who went to sea not as abstractions but as individuals. When we tell the story of the submarine's loss and the attempt to recover her, we should remember that at its heart is a human tragedy, the deaths of 98 sailors far from home. The Americans who attempted the recovery understood this. Their decision to bury the recovered sailors with military honors, their careful documentation of the ceremony, their eventual sharing of that documentation with Russia, all of these actions reflect an awareness that some things transcend the strategic calculations that otherwise dominated the Cold War. As you drift toward sleep, let yourself imagine the Pacific Ocean stretching vast and dark above K-129's resting place. Imagine the silence at that depth, so profound that a human being has never experienced it directly. Imagine the pressure, the cold, the absolute darkness that has been the submarine's environment for these many decades. Somewhere up in that darkness, where the currents flow and the fish swim in schools, the depth decreases mile by mile until eventually there is light again, and warmth, and the familiar world of air and sun that we know. That world goes on, as it has always gone on, while the deep keeps its secrets. The story of Project Azorian reminds us that some secrets are never fully revealed. The true cause of K-129 sinking, the full extent of what was recovered, the complete intelligence value of the operation, these remain partially hidden even now, decades after the events occurred. Governments hold their secrets close, and the ocean holds its secrets closer still. Let yourself sink now into the gentle darkness of approaching sleep. The story is told, the submarine rests in peace, and the night settles soft around you. There are no more secrets that need uncovering tonight, no more depths that require plumbing. Only rest, and quiet, and the slow drift toward dreams. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most remarkable chapters of Cold War history. If you found this exploration restful, please consider subscribing to Sleep Orion for more stories like this one. Your support helps others find their way here, one sleepy listener at a time. The story of Project Azorian will continue to fascinate historians and enthusiasts for generations to come. It represents a unique intersection of technology, espionage, and human drama that captures something essential about the Cold War era. The operation pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible and demonstrated that human ingenuity can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. For now, let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the tension leave your body, muscle by muscle, as you settle into the comfort of wherever you're resting tonight. The Pacific is still out there, vast and patient, holding its secrets. K-129 still rests on the bottom, silent and undisturbed. And you are here, safe and warm, drifting towards sleep as the story fades into the quiet. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well, and dream of distant waters if you dream at all. The night is deep and gentle, and morning is hours away. Rest now, and let the world turn slowly through the darkness while you sleep.